You've probably seen the headlines, the ones about geopolitics, global trade, and who's trading with whom. But what if the way we're all reading those numbers is, well, fundamentally wrong? Today, we're going to dig into a really fascinating analysis that suggests exactly that. And it all kicks off with one simple question.
So here it is. This is the big question, right? The one that's all over the news and a hot topic for commentators. Ever since Western sanctions were put on Russia, all eyes have been on the countries that are still doing business, and one nation in particular has been under some pretty intense scrutiny.
And look, on the surface, the numbers seem to tell a pretty simple story. The total dollar value of trade between India and Russia, especially in things like oil, has absolutely skyrocketed. And if you base your conclusion on that alone, it's kind of easy to jump to one very specific conclusion. And this is the interpretation you hear all the time. The thinking is pretty straightforward. More trade equals more money for Russia, which, directly works against the international effort to apply economic pressure. If you only look at those huge top-line import figures, it really seems like an open and shut case. But what if we're not asking the right question?
And this is where things get really interesting. The analysis we're looking at today, which comes from Dr. Ryan Vaidya, makes a critical shift. It argues that to get the real picture, we need to stop looking at the giant national numbers and start by asking a much, much simpler question.
This is it. This is the game-changing question. It's so simple, but it completely reframes the entire debate. Who are these imports actually for? At the end of the day, goods aren't just numbers on a spreadsheet in some government office.
Of course, they're for people. A country, as a government, doesn't consume oil, its population does. Every single import, whether it's fuel for cars or fertilizer for farms, is ultimately used by the individuals living there. So, if the imports are for the people, why aren't we measuring them that way?
So that simple idea leads us straight to the core of this whole thing, and to a really powerful tool for comparison. It's a metric economists use all the time, but for some reason it's been pretty much missing from this specific conversation.
It's a concept called per capita import. And don't worry, the math is super simple. You just take the total value of all the stuff a country imports from another nation, and you divide it by the number of people who live there. What you get is the average amount being imported for each individual person. Okay, so what actually happens when we apply this per-person metric to the data? Well, the source sets up a really powerful side-by-side comparison. India versus the European Union, which is a bloc that's officially sanctioning Russia. Let's see what the numbers actually show us. All right, let's break down the data here for the first half of 2025. Now, if you just look at that total exports column, you'd think, yep, the headlines are right. India's at a massive $25 billion, which just dwarfs the EU's $7 billion. But then you look at the next column, population. Whoa, 1.46 billion people versus 450 million. And that final column, the per capita import, that is where the story just completely flips on its head. And when you put that into a chart, wow, it is so incredibly clear. You get a totally different story. The bar for India and the bar for the European Union, they're practically the same height. All of a sudden, that whole narrative about India being this massive outlier, it just kind of vanishes when you factor in its huge population.
So let's just spell it out. Here's the bottom line. In the first half of 2025, Russian imports worked out to be about $17.10 for the average person in India. And for the average person in the European Union, the exact same amount, $17.10. Suddenly, this isn't a story about one country being an outlier, it's a story of two massive economic blocs whose people are, on average, consuming Russian goods at an identical rate.
Once you see the data laid out like this, it becomes almost impossible to go back to just relying on those simple top-line headlines. It forces us to ask a bigger question. What does a fair comparison even look like? And as this analysis argues, context is everything. And the author of this analysis, Dr. Vaidya, he doesn't mince words. He puts it very bluntly. To accuse a nation of almost 1.5 billion people using the same raw total as a bloc with a third of that population is, in his words, statistically misleading and morally unfair. It just completely ignores the reality of who is actually consuming the goods.
Okay, so let's wrap this up. What are the big takeaways from all this? First, just looking at the big total import numbers can be incredibly misleading.
Second, switching to a per-person metric gives us a much more honest picture of what's really going on with individual consumption. And finally, it suggests that if we're going to talk about economic fairness, context like population size isn't just nice to have, it's absolutely essential.
And that really leaves us with a huge question, one that goes way beyond this specific case. In our globalized world, what is the fairest way to measure a country's impact and its responsibilities? Should we be looking at nations as single entities, or should we be looking at the collective impact of the people within them? It's something to chew on for sure. Thanks for joining this explainer.